Okay, this week we've been looking at the art of Christianity. Um, Christian influence on art was very long-lasting, very widespread, and it began essentially with the decline of the Roman Empire, which resulted in the conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity. So this period that we're going to be looking at takes approximately 1100 years, beginning around 300 AD. The Roman Empire at this time, as you can see, was very extensive, all the way from the British Isles down to Spain, along northern Africa, and towards the Middle East and what is current Syria and Palestine, and Rome being right here. Rome, interestingly enough, we talk about the Grecian world, and when we say Greece, we mean the country of Greece, but when we talk about Rome, we talk about the city of Rome. Interesting fact, Italy as a country did not exist till the middle of last century. So it's one of the youngest countries, but one of the oldest civilizations on the planet. In the Roman Empire, Christians were largely persecuted. The Romans were very practical people, as we saw last time, bent mostly on civil tasks and engineering and governance and things like that. And they had quite a simple rule that the people that they conquered, whether they were down here in Spain or Africa or in the Middle East, they didn't really care what your religious affiliation was, what you believed in, as long as you swore allegiance to Caesar and paid your taxes. The Christians, on the other hand, refused to acknowledge that. Believing in the one God, they refused to acknowledge Caesar. And as a result, they were persecuted by the Romans. And so for the Christians, the Roman Empire was a period of persecution, suffering, and largely going underground and in hiding. And so the beginnings of Christian art are very interesting as a result of those historical circumstances. However, around the year 300, the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. And he did this because he had a dream one night. The next day there was a battle pending, and he was informed by his generals that there was no way they could win. They were outnumbered, and he gave the decision to go ahead. And he had a dream that night that if he was to paint a cross on the shields of all his soldiers, he will in fact win the win the battle. So he did that. He instructed his generals to paint the Christian cross on the shields of his soldiers, and miraculously they won the battle. Getting confused there. So Constantine took this as a sign that the Christians were correct, that Jesus was real, and as a result he converted to Christianity. Now the simple story would be the emperor converts to Christianity, the entire empire converts to Christianity. It's not exactly that easy, but essentially that is what happened. And so overnight, Christian religion went from an underground, persecuted religion to the official state religion. Everybody became Christian within a relatively short period of time. So the original Christians, while they were being persecuted, tended to meet and gather and have their mass and their celebrations underground in the catacombs or the tombs of ancient Rome. So these are kind of dark, scary places. Not too many people hung out, so they were relatively safe from prying eyes or bystanders. So the catacombs are where we begin to see the first sort of Christian art emerging. And one of the things they did was, because the Romans were persecuting them for being Christian, is that any image that was Christian in terms of literal depiction of, say, Jesus Christ or God, would easily have given away the fact that they were Christians. So what they did is they adopted a symbolic system. Part of the symbols included doves, birds, sheep, the Lamb of God. One of the most important symbols was this symbol right here called the Chi Rho. This is the first two letters of the word Christ in Greek. And this symbol, the Chi Rho, became synonymous with Christianity. So in a lot of the early art, they would paint this symbol or carve this symbol on the wall. It was ambiguous enough so that not too many people knew what it meant, unless of course you were Christian. So it became a sort of secret language, kind of coded language of communicating to other Christians. Other things that they used in this sort of iconography were the fish, the lamb, which we've talked about, the peacock, and the dove. And so what happens was these images sat in as representations, symbols for Christ or the people or God. And so the Christians were able to meet and gather and communicate and for the most part avoid persecution through this sort of secret language of imagery. But it wasn't completely like that. There obviously were people that were painting more realistic images depending on their experiences. And so this was probably one of the first paintings we have of Jesus. And you can see it's very, very Roman. And so we have Christ here in the middle as a philosopher, teaching, wearing a toga to his disciples in the catacombs, underground. And one of the interesting things to notice about this is that Christ is young. Christ is young and he is beardless. So this is really the first image we have of Christ, and this is the first type of image that we have for Christ for several hundred years. The Christ that's on the cross with the beard, suffering and in pain, came much, much later. All the early images of Christ showed him as a young philosopher or teacher or healer. So young man, beardless, and healing and preaching. Another device developed by the early Christians was to take Roman and Greek iconography, stories from the Greek and Roman mythological world, and reinterpret them in a Christian vein. So here's Christ, the Good Shepherd, and the Lamb on his shoulders. And so this became synonymous with Christianity, but it was actually taken from a very earlier Greek and Roman Hermes Creaphori, which is also the Good Shepherd, and lots of images were of Hermes carrying the goat or the ram on his shoulders. And so basically they just adopted or co-opted either a lot of existing symbols and reinterpreted them Christian-wise, or they created their own images of Christ as a Roman philosopher, or they communicated in a sort of symbolic system. Here we have another early tomb where we have the depiction of the stories of the Bible. We have Adam and Eve down here and Christ riding into Jerusalem on the back of the donkey here, and Christ here preaching in the temple. And when we look at Christ close up, we see that, again, he's a very young man. He's bearded, not beardless. The older gentlemen on either side have beards, and he's wearing a toga. So the earliest images of Christ, and this was after, we look at the date here, after Constantine had converted to Christianity, we see again that iconography of the young philosopher, healer, Roman, without a beard, without the cross, and without the suffering. But what happened with Christian images was very interesting. We had what's called the iconoclastic controversy. The iconoclastic controversy, to understand this, you need to understand the terms. An iconoclast, today we understand it as someone who blazes a new trail, an innovator, someone creative, someone who breaks the rules. The literal translation of the word is image, icon means image, breaker. So an iconoclast was someone who destroyed images. The opposite of that was an iconojewel or an iconophile, and this was somebody who loved images or preferred images. And what this meant was, in Christianity they had a problem. If we go back to the Roman era and we look at the size of the Roman Empire, when they converted to Christianity, there was a problem. All of a sudden, large numbers of people were wondering, what is this Christianity? And you have to remember that people did not read back then. So the best way to communicate this was through preachers, teachings, masses, but also through images. The people were illiterate, so there was this desire to have imagery. So the secret symbolism of the catacombs began to be replaced by a more representational type of imagery. Here's Jesus, here's Adam and Eve, and these are stories from the Bible. And so churches were painted with these images as ways of teaching the illiterate. What would happen was, after a period of time, people would begin to experience in different parts of the empire pestilence, famine, war, starvation, disease, and they'd begin to ask themselves, what's wrong? And what have we done wrong? And why is this happening? Which would eventually lead into the question, why is God angry with us? And more often than not, someone would come to the conclusion that we have broken God's will, God's law. If you go to the Bible, you'll find in the second commandment, you are not supposed to make images. So we look at here, this is the Hebrew version. The Ten Commandments are very interesting from a historical point of view, but we'll avoid that, the various versions that there are. But if we look at the second commandment in the Hebrew version, you shall not make for yourself any image whatsoever. Okay? And if you think about it, there are three religions that come from the Old Testament. There's Islam, there's the Hebraic religion, the Jews, and Christianity. The Old Testament says quite explicitly, thou shalt not make images. And the Jews and the Muslims took that quite literally, which is why if you go into a synagogue or you go into a mosque, you will almost never or very rarely find an image. It was considered sacrilege to make an image. There was a fear of making images, that somehow by having an image you might worship the image and therefore not God. And so the Christians would remember this or say, where have we gone wrong? And someone would point out, well, you've gone wrong because you've broken God's commandment. And so what would happen was all these works, these paintings or these mosaics or these statues would be destroyed. People would smash them, hence the term iconoclasts. And so the whole empire would just go into this frenzy of destroying images and replacing those images with symbols again. So we get the kiro, we get the fish, we get the dolphin, we get the lamb, etc. And this would go on for a few years, few generations maybe. And disease and pestilence and famine and war would come back again, and people would say, what have we done wrong? God must be angry with us. And then somebody in the back of the room would raise their hand and say, we destroyed images of Jesus. We desecrated the images of God. And people would say, oh my God, you're right. So they go back to these churches and they tear down all the symbols and they put back pictures. And anybody who was against them would be burnt at the stake or hung or killed as a heretic. And so this would go on for hundreds of years, back and forth, to have images, to not have images, do what the Bible says or break the Bible's commandment. And eventually in the 9th century, the bishops, cardinals all got together and decided we have to come to a conclusion. We have to make a decision on this. Will we have images or will we not have images? And so they listened to all the arguments, a bit like a court case. The lawyers from both sides presenting their case. And in the end, they decided, thou shalt have images, but those images will be not realistic. They will be changed slightly. Sorry, come back to this. And so this is what gave birth to the peculiarly unique style of Christian art, which I'll come to in just a second, because there are other reasons why Christians felt, thou shalt not have images, not just the Bible. The second reason was that God, the divine, was infinite. And you could not take something infinite and put it into something finite. So to make an image of God or Jesus or a statue was blasphemous in the sense that how could something so finite, so physical, so perishable, so finite and minute contain the infinite power and glory and wisdom and omniscience and omnipresence of God? And so it was seen as an impossibility. You wouldn't make images for that reason. And the third reason was nobody had actually seen what God looked like or what Jesus looked like. The Bible does not have any description of Jesus' physical appearance. So it would be a bit like this. Let's say I painted this picture, which I didn't. But let's say I did, and I showed this to you, and I said, oh, here's your grandmother. What might you reply? You'd look at this and say, well, it's not my grandmother. And I might reply, well, yes, it is your grandmother. It's an old lady, and your grandmother's an old lady, and I painted a picture of your grandmother. And you'd look at me, and you'd furrow your brow, and you'd think I was probably a little crazy. And you'd say, no, it's not my grandmother. And I'd say, yes, it is. And so what if I continued like this? You would conclude that I was somehow a little crazy, slightly mad. Why? Well, because I haven't seen your grandmother. I don't know what your grandmother looks like. And so to present an image of her would be basically telling a lie. That was also the reason why people felt that you could not make an image of Jesus or God. That unless you'd seen Jesus or God, you couldn't possibly make an image. That would be lying. So very much the Christian ethic or the Christian approach to images owes a lot to Plato, to the idea of this divine level of being of which this world is just imperfect and too finite, and the idea of art as an illusion or a trick. So when we put all those things together, we get a very Platonic view of the world. So what happened with Christianity when they came to the resolution of the controversy was a style which has loosely been labeled the Byzantine style. I remember this class was a class of generalities. It's a survey class. there's a general term for the Byzantine style, and then there's a very specific use of that term that scholars would use, but we're trying to keep things very simple at this stage. The Byzantine style was a way of representing images, creating images that you would not mistake for being real. So the approach, the style, the technique was flat, very stylized, very stiff. The proportions were not right. The shading was not right. Everything about the Byzantine style is very formulaic. So there's a way to do Mary's face. This is how you would do eyes. This is how you would do a nose. This was how you... Nobody looks like this. You know, this person walked into the room, we'd all have a heart attack. Jesus, though he's supposed to be a baby because he's the king of the Jews, he's a little man. So we have the proportions of the head too small. We have the hands and the shading and everything about it. The folds on Jesus's robe is very, very flat. It's two-dimensional. So there's not a sense that we might mistake this for being somehow real. And so this was the compromise. Essentially, the church decided not to recognize the second commandment, not to consider it one of the 10. And again, if you look at the history of the commandments, you'll see that it was actually removed from the Catholic version. And they settled on this style. And so this style, or something similar to this style, became the dominant way of making images all over the Roman Empire. But there would be different schools, Russian versions, Greek versions, English versions, etc. Here's another example. This is from an illuminated manuscript, so this would be a book, possibly the Bible, or a hymnal with songs, or maybe a commentary on the Bible. But just notice the figures, how flat they are, how out of proportion they are, how stiff. Look at the trees. You know, something you probably would see out of Dr. Seuss rather than real trees. And here we have an angel coming out of heaven talking to Adam and Eve. This image also illustrates another point. It's very hard for us to understand these types of images here in the 21st century. But they were very, very powerful, and people would debate and puzzle over them in ways that we might find very confusing. For example, one of the biggest problems in early Christian art was the idea of the belly button. You know, should Adam and Eve have belly buttons? If you think about it, the belly button is a result of an umbilical cord, which means you had a mother. If Adam and Eve were the first human beings, they were not born of a woman. And so artists would have debates, theological debates on, do you put a belly button on? Do you not put a belly button on? If you put one on, it looked strange, but if you didn't put one on, it looked really strange. So one of the solutions, funny enough, was to actually have them bending a lot and put creases right here, wrinkles. So that way they can avoid or sidestep the whole issue of whether or not to have a belly button. So these are the kinds of things, you know, the church fathers and artists would argue about and have really heady debates, and to us seems rather humorous and entertaining. Another example of the Byzantine style, here's a city in the background. We can see that the city is way too small for the proportions. The people look to be floating. The light is very stylized, hitting one side of the leg. And even this, if you look at the step that Jesus is standing on, the back of the step is wider than the front of the step. If you've looked at a photograph of roads or train tracks, you notice that as you go further back, things get closer together. That's called perspective. And so this is actually a reverse perspective. This was not because the artists were not very good at drawing or didn't know about space. It's because they had the idea that the vanishing point, where the lines meet, this line here, if we follow this line forward, we follow this line forward, where they meet is a point down here called the vanishing point, which would be where the viewer is. It's in front of the painting. In typical Western representational imagery, the vanishing point is in the back. The lines all meet at the distance on the horizon. But in Byzantine art, they were often placed in front of the picture because the picture was seen as a method or a tool towards meditation and prayer and contemplation of the divine. And so the vanishing point, everything was focused in the soul of the viewer. The predominant art form back then was mosaic, which are very, very small tiles of glass and ceramic, often backed with gold leaf, so that the light coming into the churches would bounce off the walls and glow and light up the entire inside of the building. Building buildings with windows was not very developed at this point. Windows meant cutting holes in walls, and that would make the walls thinner and the walls weaker and prone to collapse and destruction. So they had pretty solid walls, pretty solid columns, and so they would expand the light inside through the use of gold. As we move later through history, 400 or 500 years later, we begin to see the bearded Christ. And so here's Christ bearded. And this is actually a type of image of Christ called Christ Pantocrator. And it was often placed behind the altar or at the entrance. And it's Christ the judge. So he's watching you, he's got his eyes on you, and he's making sure you're doing right. So we go from an image of Christ as being very youthful, about being a teacher or a healer, to Christ as a judge, watching you, and then we end up with Christ later on the cross suffering and dying. But all this was rather mixed. Here we have in the 6th century another image of Christ, beardless again, wearing the royal purple of emperors, handing out the loaves and fishes from the story in the Bible, and again wearing Roman tunics. When we come to the end of the first millennium, we enter a period known as the Romanesque. Now, this period is very interesting because prior to this, we have a period of European history known as the Middle Ages, or if you believe the people of the Renaissance, it's called the Dark Ages, where not a lot happened. And that's not a very accurate way of looking at things, but we'll accept that for now. We'll just move forward to the end of the first millennia. And people actually believe that at this point, Christ was going to come. This was the apocalypse. This was the end of the world. And so people prepared to die. They gave up all their belongings. They knew Christ was coming. Well, it wasn't the end of the world. Christ did not come. The apocalypse was not seen. Rather than have that event be a cause for giving up one's faith, it became a cause of celebration. They merely reinterpreted the event and said they got it wrong. The apocalypse is probably 1500 or coming in the future, and we mistakenly thought it was happening at the end of the millennia. So what this did is it actually revived a lot of faith and enthusiasm in the Christian church, and people began to be very thankful, very joyful, and the spirit of Christianity was revived in a really big way. And so what happened was churches were built. Hang on, I'll come back to this in a minute. Lots of churches were built on roadsides, at holy places, on places of pilgrimage. So people began to make pilgrimages to holy places to give thanks to God, thanks to Jesus. And on these pilgrimages, they had to stop, they had to sleep, they had to stay in places. And churches began to spring up along here. There was also the Crusades, where people had their renewed spirit of Christianity and fervor and going to the Holy Land. And so the whole idea of moving and having pilgrimages and going to other places became very, very popular. And so all these churches began to pop up to house, people would sleep in the churches, eat in the churches, live in the churches, go to Mass in the churches. And so all of these churches, a whole revival of church building happened all throughout Europe. The style of the church is referred to as Romanesque because largely it was based on the Roman column and the Roman arch. So here we look at the round arch. And this was, going back to this picture, one of the great features of Roman architecture was the arch. The arch is one of the strongest architectural structures known to man. And so when all else fails, you'll often see in ruins, the arch still stands. So here's the Roman Colosseum, built with arches a long, long time ago, nearly 2,000 years. And so the arch in architecture became dominant, and the churches that sprang up were based on this Roman style, hence the name Romanesque. Other characteristics of the church were they were very thick, they were very heavy, the walls were solid, they were massive. So they had this kind of heavy density to them. Inside, they were based on the idea of the basilica, which is a long meeting hall. And so you would have a very long rectangular building with arches and often a wooden ceiling with some windows at the top. But the windows had to be kept small because the structure was supported by the immensity and the thickness of the walls. And again, the arches would be repeated throughout the building. This period, this Romanesque period, slowly began to give way to the next period in art, which is really a period in architecture known as the Gothic. And the Gothic period was a desire to take this round, heavy, solid building and to infuse it with light. And the inspiration for that came from an individual by the name of Abbot Suger. Here's a picture of him. And he was the abbot of this church, the Abbey of Saint-Denis in France. And he created a whole theology about light, and God being light, and Jesus being light, and light being this immaterial substance that was very spiritual. And so his work and the work of his followers began to focus on the use of light, not just in the liturgy or in the philosophy and the teachings, but also embodied in the architecture of the building. And so they strove to bring in more windows, bigger windows, and also stained glass. But here we see in Saint-Denis, it's still based on the Roman arch. But what's happening is the windows are getting taller and they're getting skinnier. And if you look also, they're beginning to get a little pointed. And we can see these two right here, a little bit more arch-like. And then here we get this very pointed triangular structure. So what slowly begins to happen is the churches become taller, skinnier, thinner, the windows become more dominant, and they become more light-filled, and that light passes through colored glass, also known as stained glass windows. And so here's the inside of the Abbey of Saint-Denis, and if we compare it to St. Michael's, the Romanesque, we can see this very solid structure here begins to be replaced by this very aerial, light, high, massive type of structure. And so what happens with the cathedrals is you begin to get architectural developments where the walls go higher and more of the wall becomes glass. And so these developments were occasioned by various architectural and engineering feats. One of the most famous churches in the Gothic period, and I'll come back to these engineering feats in a minute, was Chartres Cathedral. And here we can see the front of Chartres Cathedral. This is the rose window, or the stained glass window. And what's interesting about Chartres Cathedral is that it burnt down at one point, or half of it burnt down. It was rebuilt. And so we look at the two towers here and here. We have two different time periods of Gothic architecture. This is early Gothic, and so we begin to get those pointed, still kind of rounded, striving up to the sky, just like Saint-Denis. And over here we get a later Gothic. And if you look at the difference between the two, you'll see that the later Gothic is a little more airy, a little more delicate. It's got filigree, a little more pointy, and by comparison, the earlier Gothic looks a little more solid. You might even say Romanesque. So as Gothic art progressed, as the style developed, it got thinner and lighter and higher and taller, till you get places like this in Cologne, Germany, where it almost looks like a spaceship. You know, everything's just very light. It's rising up to the top, lots of spires and points, very sharp, very delicate. And the idea of a cathedral was that you would walk in and the first thing you do is you would look up. So it's all about raising your head up. Your focus, your attention is on the divine, is on this other world. It's not the earthly world that you're living in, that you're suffering in, that you have disease and famine. It's this other world. And so you can imagine the effect these cathedrals had on the local population. When you walk into a building like this, it's very, very tall, full of light, full of color. And one of the engineering techniques they used to hold the walls up, because the walls had so much glass in them that they could easily fall over, was this thing right here. You see these little ribs? They're basically much like people leaning against the building and holding it up. They're called buttresses, and in this case, because they're outside the building, they're called flying buttresses. So it's almost like they're leaning on the church and they're holding the walls in so that the walls don't fall out and collapse. But here in the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, again, we see all the usual high Gothic features. The spire is very pointy. The windows are pointy. They're no longer arched like the Roman arch. They become the pointy arch with the triangles above them. And all this tracery and filigree and detail that's happening all over the cathedral. It's almost like I don't know, some kind of wedding cake possibly. And the rose windows became a dominant feature. The window would be made of colored glass, and the amazing thing about that was that when sun passes through that, that color would light up the interior. And so here we see a church in San Francisco lit up purely by stained glass. Now, just looking at this, you could imagine the effect, again, on the local population. You live in a wooden, mud, dirty hut, and you come in and you see a building like